The great hall of Ashvale Palace had seen many spectacles in its 1,000 years of standing. It had witnessed coronations drenched in gold light, treaty signings that ended wars spanning generations, and funerals so elaborate that the mourners themselves forgot who they were grieving. But on the morning that Alpha King Kael Voss stepped onto the dais with that particular expression on his face, the assembled nobility of the primordial court somehow sensed, in the way that prey senses a shift in the wind, that what they were about to witness would surpass all of it. The hall was packed. Every lord and lady who held even a whisper of influence had arranged themselves in careful formations, their silks and velvets pressed to severity, their jewels catching the pale morning light that filtered through the high obsidian windows. They had been summoned, all of them, by a royal decree so brief and so lacking in explanation that speculation had run rampant for 3 days. Some said the king was finally choosing his mate. Others said he was dissolving the High Council entirely. A few of the bolder gossips suggested he had lost his mind altogether, which, given what he was about to announce, was perhaps not entirely unfair. Kyle stood at the center of the dais and let the silence do its work. He was not a man who needed ceremony to command a room. He was tall in the way that ancient things are tall, carrying his height not as an accident of birth, but as a statement of what he was. The oldest living alpha of the primordial line, a being whose power predated the current court by 4 centuries. His hair was dark, his jaw was set, and his golden eyes moved across the assembled faces with an expression that managed to be simultaneously bored and dangerous, which was, those who knew him understood, his most honest face. He was not performing boredom. He was genuinely, profoundly tired of every single person in the room, and he was about to tell them so, in the most elaborate possible way. "My lords and ladies," he said, and his voice carried without effort, the way thunder carries, not loudly, but completely, filling every corner without trying. "I have called you here because the matter of my mating bond has become, I am told, a source of significant anxiety for the court. My council informs me weekly, sometimes daily, that my failure to select a mate is destabilizing the kingdom. My advisors have prepared lists. My steward has organized viewings. I have received, in the past 6 months alone, 47 formal proposals from noble houses offering their daughters, nieces, and in one memorable case, a cousin twice removed who was described, and I am quoting directly, as pleasingly symmetrical." He paused. The hall was absolutely silent. "I have decided that they are right. The time has come. I will choose my mate today." The exhale of relief from the assembled nobility was almost audible. Shoulders dropped. Fans began to flutter. Lady Oren, whose daughter Vivian had been groomed for exactly this moment for the past 3 years, touched her own collarbone in barely concealed triumph. Lord Cassin, who had brought his niece all the way from the Northern Territories specifically for this announcement, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. They had won. The king was finally being reasonable. "I will choose her," Kael continued, his voice carrying the same flat, conversational tone, "from among the women already present in this palace. Specifically, I will choose the woman that your court, by its own collective judgment, considers the least suitable, the least beautiful, by your standards, the least connected, the least impressive, the one you have all, in your wisdom, decided does not matter." He tilted his head slightly. "I want to see what your standards have been missing." The silence that followed was of a different quality entirely. It was the silence of a room full of people who had just heard something that their minds refused, for a moment, to process. Lady Oren's hand had gone very still against her collarbone. Lord Cassin's smile had not yet decided whether to stay or leave. And then, slowly, the murmuring began, low and confused and rippling outward from the center of the crowd like something dropped into still water. Before the murmuring could become argument, Kael turned to his left, where his head steward Aldrich stood with the expression of a man who had been briefed on this plan and had spent 3 days hoping it was a joke. "Bring her," the king said simply. And Aldrich, because he was nothing if not professional, turned and walked toward the side entrance of the great hall, without allowing his face to do anything regrettable. The woman who entered the hall 60 seconds later did not make an entrance in any traditional sense. She did not pause in the doorway. She did not survey the crowd. She walked in the way she always walked. Quickly, purposefully, with her eyes slightly down and her arms full of a leather satchel that she clearly had not been given the opportunity to set down before being escorted here. She was wearing her work clothes, which is to say, a long dress in a shade of brown so unremarkable it seemed to be apologizing for existing, over which she wore a linen overskirt with 2 large pockets that were visibly stuffed with papers and what appeared to be a small brass measuring tool. Her hair was pulled back severely enough to suggest that she considered it a problem to be managed rather than a feature to be displayed. Her glasses, small and wire-framed, were slightly crooked, which she appeared not to have noticed. Her name was Sarah Ashvale. She was 26 years old. She was the head archivist of the Palace Record Hall, which was a position so thoroughly ignored by the court that most of the nobility could not have told you it existed. She catalogued. She preserved. She cross-referenced. She spent her days in a series of underground rooms, surrounded by documents that no one else had touched in decades, and she was, by every visible metric, exactly the kind of woman the court had agreed, without ever explicitly saying so, was beneath their notice. She reached the center of the hall, looked up, registered that approximately 300 people were staring at her, and then looked at the king with an expression that was not fear or excitement, or even confusion, but something that landed closer to wary assessment. She had been told nothing except that the king required her presence. She was doing what she always did with incomplete information. She was waiting for more data. If you have ever watched someone discover that they are the subject of a story rather than a bystander to one, you know that there is usually a moment of visible recalibration. Sarah had that moment when Kale descended from the dais and walked toward her, because Alpha Kings did not walk toward archivists. That was simply not a thing that happened. And yet here was the incontrovertible evidence that it was happening. And so she adjusted. She straightened. She shifted the satchel on her shoulder. She did not step back, which told Kale something he filed away immediately. Sarah Ashvale, he said, stopping 2 feet from her, head archivist of the Palace Record Hall. Yes, she said. Her voice was clear and even, which, given the circumstances, represented either extraordinary composure or an extremely thorough failure to understand what was happening. I am choosing you, he said. As my mate. The hall erupted. Not in cheers, because this was not a cheering crowd, but in the aristocratic equivalent of eruption, which involved a great deal of urgent whispering, several people clutching their neighbors' arms, and Lady Oren making a sound that was technically inaudible but communicated volumes. Sarah, for her part, looked at the king for a long moment. Then she looked at the crowd. Then she looked back at the king. Why? She asked. And this single syllable delivered with the same tone one might use to request clarification on a filing discrepancy, was the moment that Kale Voss felt something shift in his chest in a way that had nothing to do with his plan, and everything to do with the woman standing in front of him. He had prepared for fear. He had prepared for gratitude. He had prepared, in his darkest estimation of humanity, for simpering acceptance. He had not prepared for why. Because, he said. And he was aware that he was improvising now, which almost never happened. I have been told for 4 centuries what value looks like. I have decided to look somewhere else. Sarah considered this. She considered it with the same focused attention she gave to disputed land records, which is to say, completely and without performance. Then she nodded once. All right, she said. I'll need to set some conditions. The whispering in the hall achieved new heights. Kale blinked. In 4 centuries, no one had ever responded to a royal declaration by setting conditions. Go on, he said, because what else was there to say? I keep my work, she said. I have ongoing preservation projects that cannot be interrupted. I need continued access to the record hall, my tools and my staff, both of them. I also need it made clear in whatever formal documentation this requires that my role does not preclude my professional responsibilities. I'm in the middle of cataloging the pre-consolidation administrative records. and there are indices that will be lost permanently if the work stops now. She paused. Those are my conditions. Cale stared at her. The hall stared at her. Lady Oreni appeared to be experiencing some kind of medical episode. And then, for the first time in recent memory, Alpha King Cale Voss smiled. Not the controlled political expression he deployed at court functions, but something smaller and more genuine. The kind of smile that appears when something genuinely unexpected happens. To a person who believed they had seen everything. Agreed, he said. All of it. And that was how it began. If you're already intrigued by what's unfolding here, take a moment to hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. Because this story is only just getting started, and you absolutely do not want to miss what comes next. The formal ceremony binding the mating declaration was brief, because Cale had insisted on it, and the paperwork that followed was not brief at all, because Sarah had insisted on that. She sat across from the royal scribe for 2 hours in a small anteroom off the Great Hall, while 300 nobles cooled their heels in the corridor, methodically reviewing every clause of the Mate Rights Charter with the focus of someone who had read worse documents and found significant errors in them. The scribe, a man of 60 years who had processed every royal document for the past 3 decades, later told his wife that it was the most professionally satisfying interaction of his career. He had also never had anyone catch 4 ambiguities in a standard charter in a single reading. Kyle waited. He sat in a chair outside the anteroom and waited, which was itself a remarkable thing, because kings did not wait. Their schedule was the schedule everything else arranged itself around. His personal guard, a man named Boren, who had served him for 2 decades and believed he had seen everything, stood at parade rest 3 feet away and maintained his expression, with heroic effort. Through the closed door, they could occasionally hear Sarah's voice, clear and specific, asking questions about jurisdictional precedent in mate rights disputes. Boren said nothing. Cale said nothing. They both listened to the muffled sound of the woman who was apparently going to be queen conducting a legal review, and neither of them addressed the fact that this was the most interesting thing that had happened in the palace in at least a decade. The apartments prepared for the first mate were in the East Wing, a suite of rooms that had not been occupied in over 100 years, and had accordingly been maintained in a state of ornate, airless perfection. Every surface polished, every drapery pressed, every decorative object arranged with the kind of rigid precision that communicates wealth while communicating absolutely nothing else. Sarah stood in the doorway for a moment, after the steward opened it, surveying the room. Then she turned to the steward and asked if there was a room with better natural light and fewer breakable things on the shelves, because she worked with documents and would need to spread materials out. The steward, whose name was Mira, and who had been assigned to attend the first mate with a great deal of private skepticism, looked at the woman in the sensible brown dress with her crooked glasses and her overstuffed satchel, and then looked at the immaculate suite of rooms behind her, and had a small, silent reorientation of her expectations. "There is a study adjacent to this suite," she said after a moment. "It has a large north-facing window." "That would be better," Sarah said. "Can we move the desk from in there to replace this one? The one in the sitting room is purely decorative. I need something I can actually use." Mira found that she was nodding before she had consciously decided to. "I'll arrange it," she said. And then, because something about Sarah's manner invited directness in a way that court life usually did not, she added, "The court is not going to make this easy for you." Sarah looked at her. "I know," she said. "They haven't made anything easy for 7 years. I've managed." She shifted her satchel. "Is there somewhere I can have dinner sent? I'd rather work this evening than attend the welcome dinner." "I assume there's a welcome dinner." "There is," Mira said. "Lady Oren organized it." "Then I definitely cannot attend," Sarah said, with a dryness so complete it took Mira a full second to recognize it as humor. "I'll have something in the study." Mira arranged the desk and arranged the dinner, and found herself, by the end of the evening, genuinely curious about what was going to happen next. She was not the only one. The formal presentation of the first mate to the court was scheduled for 3 days hence, which gave the court approximately 72 hours to work itself into a state of collective outrage, speculation, and maneuvering that would have been exhausting to anyone who cared about it. Sarah, who did not, spent those 3 days doing exactly what she had said she would do: working. She had negotiated access to the record hall every morning, and she arrived there each day at 7th bell and worked until Mira came to tell her that whatever meeting or fitting or instruction session had been scheduled required her attendance. The record hall was, by any objective measure, a remarkable place. It occupied the entire lowest level of the East Wing, a series of vaulted stone rooms that had been built when the palace was first constructed and had been accumulating documents ever since. The collection it contained was extraordinary. Centuries of administrative records, treaty documents, land grants, census records, correspondence between the crown and every noble house that had ever existed, records of births and deaths and titles and disputes going back to the founding of the kingdom. It was also, by the standards of current court culture, completely invisible. The previous 3 archivists had been appointed as formalities and had done approximately nothing. Sarah had been appointed because she had applied, repeatedly, and because she had eventually submitted a report on the deteriorating condition of the pre-consolidation records that was so detailed and so alarming that someone had eventually forwarded it to the relevant office, who had appointed her partly to make her stop submitting reports. She had spent the past 7 years doing what she had promised to do, which was to preserve, catalog, and index the collection. She had done it alone, mostly, with 2 assistants who had been assigned to her and who had stayed because she was, despite everything, genuinely interesting to work for. She had done it without resources, without recognition, and without any particular expectation that anyone would ever care. She cared, which was enough. The records were real. The history was real. The obligation to preserve it was real. Everything else was noise. On the second morning of her new status, she was deep in the pre-consolidation administrative files when she found something that made her stop. It was a land grant, not unusual in itself. The collection contained thousands of land grants, but this one was unusual in 2 ways. The first was that it had been filed incorrectly, placed among records from a century earlier than its actual date, which suggested that it had been moved deliberately rather than through simple error. The second was the seal at the bottom of the document. She had seen that seal before. She had seen it exactly once, in a foundational document she had catalogued 3 years ago, a document she had flagged as significant, and which had subsequently been given a restricted access designation by a notation she did not remember being there when she first catalogued it. She set the land grant aside and pulled out her cross-reference journal, a personal document she kept separate from the official cataloging records, and she began to write. Please take a moment right now to drop a comment below and tell me what you think Sarah just found, because I have a feeling you've already started putting the pieces together. The formal presentation went exactly as everyone expected it to go, which is to say, badly. The court had organized itself into a display of polite hostility, so practiced it bordered on art. Every lady present had worn their finest, as if to emphasize by contrast. Every lord had perfected an expression of bewildered condescension. Lady Oren had positioned herself and her daughter Vivienne in direct sightline of the dais, which was a choice that communicated everything she wanted it to communicate without requiring her to say a single impolitic word. Sarah arrived on time, which was itself mildly disruptive, because court events operated on a social lateness that communicated status. She arrived on time because she had scheduled herself to arrive on time, and she saw no reason to operate on a different schedule, because other people had decided that punctuality was beneath them. She was wearing what Mira had helped her select, a deep blue dress that was elegant without being ornate, which was as far as Sarah had been willing to go toward court aesthetics. Her hair was properly arranged. Her glasses were straight. She had left the satchel in the study. She walked through the crowd with the same quality of movement she had in the great hall. Not performing ease, simply being at ease, which was a different thing entirely, and one that the court, practiced as it was in the performance of everything, found deeply disorienting. She reached the dais. She stood beside Cale. She did not look at the crowd with defiance or anxiety. She looked at them the way she looked at a new collection of documents. with assessment. Kyle, standing beside her, noticed. He had been watching since she walked in, because he found, somewhat to his own annoyance, that watching her had become interesting. He had expected the presentation to be a demonstration of his point, the court confronted with their own snobbery. It was that, but it was also something else. Sarah beside him was not a prop in his argument. She was a person who was independently navigating a hostile environment with a degree of calm that he recognized, with something like respect, as genuine rather than performed. "You're not afraid of them," he said, quietly enough that only she could. "Here, I've known most of them for 7 years," she said, with the same quietness. "They ignored me completely. It's hard to be afraid of people who didn't know you existed. And now they know. Now they know," she agreed. "That's their problem, not mine." The receiving line lasted 2 hours. Kale stood beside Sarah and watched with private satisfaction as 200 members of the court attempted to process the situation. Some managed graciousness. Most managed a form of frozen politeness. A handful failed entirely, their expressions cycling through shock and offense and poorly concealed disdain in ways that would have been humiliating if they had been aware they were doing it. Sarah received all of it with the same consistent expression, attentive, courteous, and fundamentally unbothered. Lord Draven approached midway through the line. He was the head of the High Council, a man in his 80s who had served as chief advisor to 3 kings and who carried his age the way. Powerful men often do, as if time itself had assessed him and decided not to bother. He took Sarah's hand with the courtly formality that was second nature to him, and looked at her over it with eyes that were considerably sharper than his practiced smile. "Sarah Ashvale," he said. "We have, I believe, corresponded." "We have," Sarah said. "Twice. Once regarding the restricted access notation added to the Kylum Foundation Charter, and once regarding my request for additional preservation materials, which was declined." Draven's smile did not waver, because it was not the kind of smile that wavered, but his eyes changed slightly, a minute adjustment that Sarah registered and catalogued the same way she catalogued everything. "The record hall is fortunate to have such a dedicated keeper," he said smoothly. "I hope your new responsibilities won't detract from the work." "They won't," Sarah said. "I've already made arrangements." He moved on. Sarah watched him go. Then she turned back to the line, but something in her posture had changed, very slightly, in a way that Kyle, who had been watching, noticed. After the receiving line ended and the assembled court dispersed into the dinner that followed, he fell into step beside her. "Draven," he said. It was not a question. "He added the restricted access notation to a document," she said, equally quiet. "He shouldn't have had the authority to do that. It's a foundational charter. Changes to access require approval from the Archive, Oversight Council, which hasn't convened in 30 years, and which technically the First Mate has a seat on." Kale was quiet for a moment. "You knew that before today. I found it in the charter bylaws 2 years ago," she said. "I didn't have standing to act on it. I do now." He looked at her. She looked back at him. Something passed between them that was not yet warm enough to be called warmth, but was in the same general territory. The specific recognition of someone who is, it turns out, considerably more than you had reason to expect. "You came prepared," he said. "I always come prepared," she said. "That's why no one ever noticed me doing it." The dinner that evening was, by court standards, a success. By Kale's standards, it was the most interesting meal he had eaten in years, because for the first time in years, the person seated beside him was saying things he had not already anticipated. Sarah did not make small talk. She made conversation, specific and engaged, asking questions about the administrative structure of the court that managed to be simultaneously polite and subtly interrogative, gathering information the way she gathered everything, methodically, and without drawing attention to the process. Kale answered her questions. He also, for the first time in longer than he wanted to calculate, asked questions himself, not out of social obligation, but out of genuine interest. She had been in the record hall for 7 years. She had read things that no one else had read in decades. He had been running a kingdom for 4 centuries and had never once thought to ask the archivist what she knew. It occurred to him, sometime between the 3rd course and the 4th, that this was exactly the kind of structural blindness he had spent 4 centuries complaining about in other people. "Tell me about the pre-consolidation records," he said, when the table noise had risen enough to provide cover for actual conversation. Sarah set down her fork. It was, he would later recognize, a tell. She set things down when she was about to say something she considered important. "The pre-consolidation period covers approximately 200 years before the founding of the current kingdom," she said. "It's the least documented period in the collection, partly because of natural loss, and partly because of what appears to be deliberate removal. Approximately 40% of the administrative records from that period are missing. Not deteriorated. Missing. The gaps are specific and consistent in a way that random loss would not produce. Deliberate removal," he said. "By whom?" "That," she said, "is what I've been trying to determine for 3 years. She paused. "The land grant I found yesterday is the first direct physical link between the gaps and a specific noble house. The seal on the document belongs to a family that, according to current court records, does not exist. But according to the pre-consolidation records that do survive, they were the founding family of the kingdom." The table noise continued around them. Kyle looked at her. "Say the name," he said. "Calum," she said. The name sat between them for a moment with a weight that the surrounding dinner party was entirely unaware of. The Calum line, the name that appeared in the oldest ceremonial texts as the founders. The name that had been quietly, thoroughly, professionally erased from the administrative and legal record over the course of 2 centuries. The name that, if it still had living descendants, would have a claim to the throne that predated every noble house in the room. "The restricted access notation on the Foundation Charter," Cale said slowly, "was added 31 years ago," Sarah said. 3 years before Lord Draven was appointed to the High Council. He was, at the time, the legal advisor to the council member who held his current seat, the one who died under circumstances the official record describes as sudden illness. Cale did not move. He was very good at not moving when information required processing. "You have documentation." "I have fragments," she said, "which is why I need to get back into the restricted section of the record hall. The full picture is in there. I can feel it the way you feel a document that's hiding something. The weight is wrong. Too heavy for what's visible on the surface." She looked at him steadily. "I need your authority to lift the restricted access notation. The Archive Oversight Council needs to convene." "Done," he said. "Just like that?" she asked. And there was something in her voice that was almost, not quite, but almost startled. "Just like that," he said. "I've been looking for a reason to overhaul the council for a decade. You've just given me the procedural grounds to do it through a mechanism even Draven can't challenge without exposing himself." He picked up his wineglass. "You said you came prepared. So did I. I just didn't know what I was preparing for." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her own wineglass, and they did not toast, because that would have been dramatic, and neither of them was inclined toward drama, but they both drank, and it meant the same thing. "If you haven't subscribed yet, now would be an excellent time, because we are building toward something that is going to be absolutely worth being here for." The Archive Oversight Council convened for the first time in 31 years, on a gray Tuesday morning in the small council chamber adjacent to the record hall. This was not where it was traditionally held. Traditionally, it met in the Grand Advisory Chamber, with all the pageantry that implied. But Sarah had requested the smaller room on the grounds that it was adjacent to the primary source materials, and Cale had approved the request, and so here they were. 6 people in a room that smelled of old paper and good stone, arranged around a table that had clearly been cleaned for the occasion, but still had traces of ink, along one edge that Sarah privately recognized as hers. The council membership, as defined by the original charter, was specific. The first mate, the royal archivist, the chief scribe, the eldest member of the founding noble houses, the senior member of the High Council, and the king. Cale had not, in 3 decades of no convening, replaced the charter membership. He had simply not called the meeting, so the senior member of the High Council present was Lord Draven himself, which Cale had arranged with precision, and Draven had been unable to decline without giving a reason he did not want to give. Draven arrived with the air of a man who had calculated his risks and determined they were manageable. He was wrong, but he did not know that yet. He greeted the room with the practiced warmth of a political survivor, and took his seat, and looked at Sarah across the table with the same sharp eyes that had assessed her at the dinner, and this time, in the smaller room, with less socials noise to work with, she could see something behind the sharpness that she catalogued as concern. Good, she thought. That meant he already knew something was wrong. It was easier to work with people who were already aware they had a problem than with people who were still comfortable. She opened the meeting in her capacity as First Mate and Archive Oversight Chair, which was a title she was still slightly astonished to hold, not because she doubted its legitimacy, but because she was aware that its legitimacy was exactly what Draven would contest if he could find grounds. He could not find grounds. She had read the charter 4 times in 2 days, and it was, as original charters tended to be, very clear. The purpose of this convening, she said, setting her hands flat on the table, is to review and potentially reverse a restricted access notation added to the Calum Foundation Charter in the year 341 of the Kingdom's calendar. The notation was added without convening this council as required by charter procedure and is therefore procedurally invalid. She looked at Draven. Lord Draven, as the council member whose predecessor facilitated the original notation, you are required by charter to provide either a procedural justification for the notation or a consent to its reversal. Do you have a procedural justification? Draven looked at her with those sharp, calculating eyes. Then he looked at Cale. Cale looked back at him with an expression that communicated absolutely nothing, which was, those who knew him understood, not blankness, but intention. Draven had served under him for 30 years. He knew the expression. He knew what it meant. He looked back at Sarah. The notation was applied, he said carefully, on the grounds of document sensitivity, specifically the potential for misinterpretation of historical records during a period of political instability. Which authority under the Charter permits restricted access to be applied? On grounds of political sensitivity? Sarah asked, and her voice was exactly the same as it had been when she was reviewing the Mate Rights Charter with the Royal Scribe, clear and specific, and genuinely curious, which was somehow more unsettling than accusation would have been. Draven opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. Article 14, he said, permits restricted access for documents whose release could threaten public order. Article 14 permits restricted access for documents containing active military intelligence or ongoing criminal investigation materials, Sarah said. The Calum Foundation Charter is a founding administrative document. Could you clarify how it meets either of those definitions? The chief scribe, who had been taking notes, was writing very quickly. The royal archivist, Sarah's predecessor, who had been called back for this council by royal request, and was 20 years retired and had approximately no political concerns left, was watching. With an expression of deep personal satisfaction, Draven was silent for a moment. It was not the silence of someone gathering their thoughts. It was the silence of someone reassessing the terrain and not liking what they found. The notation, he said finally, was applied in good faith based on advice of the legal counsel at the time. Then you consent to its reversal, given that the legal justification is procedurally unsupported? Sarah asked. The silence stretched. Kyle said nothing. He had said nothing since the meeting began, which was itself a statement. He was not intervening. He was not rescuing. He was witnessing. And his witness in this room, with these people, was the thing that made Draven's next calculation matter. I consent to review, Draven said at last. A full procedural review of the notation's application. Which will result, Sarah said, still in that same clear, even voice, in a finding of procedural invalidity, since the charter requirements for restricted access were not met, at which point the notation will be reversed as a matter of procedural necessity. So we are agreed that the outcome is reversal. with the documentation of review providing the procedural record. She looked around the table. Does anyone object? No one objected. The vote was called. The notation was reversed. The Calum Foundation Charter was restored to open access, effective immediately. Draven gathered his things with the contained movements of a man who was not yet finished, but understood that the current engagement was over. He looked at Sarah as he rose. You are very thorough, he said, with a courtesy so precise it was indistinguishable from its opposite. Thank you, she said. I've had a lot of practice. He left. The other council members followed, with various expressions ranging from impressed to shaken. The retired royal archivist stopped beside Sarah on his way out and looked at her over his spectacles, which were considerably older and more battered than hers, and said, Young woman, whatever you're about to find in that charter, be careful who you show it to first. He glanced at Kyle. Or perhaps you already know that. Then he walked out, and the door closed, and Kyle and Sarah were alone in the room that smelled of old paper and her ink. He knows, she said. He's known for 31 years, Kyle said. He's been managing it for 31 years. He stood up and walked to the window, which was set low in the stone, and looked out onto the record hall's inner courtyard. How much is in the charter? I haven't read the full text yet, she said. The restricted section has the complete version. But based on what I've found in the cross-references, enough. She paused. Kale, the Calum line. If their descendants exist, they have a prior claim. Not just historically, legally. The Foundation Charter established succession rights that predate the current primordial law. I know, he said. She looked at him. You're not worried. I've been king for 400 years, he said, because no one else wanted the paperwork. He turned from the window and looked at her with an expression that was, for the first time, something close to open. If the Calum descendants exist, I would rather know. I would rather the kingdom know. The alternative is continuing to run a kingdom on a foundation that someone decided to hide, and that is precisely the kind of thing that breaks apart slowly and catastrophically. He paused. Also, he added with a dryness that she recognized, because she used it herself, I have a feeling you're going to find out regardless. I would prefer to be informed as it happens rather than afterward. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her satchel and her cross-reference journal and stood up. Come to the record hall with me, she said. I'll show you what I've found so far. He came. Drop a comment right now and tell me. Did you see this connection coming? Because what they're about to find in that archive is going to change everything. The restricted section of the record hall was accessible through a door that Sarah had a key to, and which, she noted, had a secondary lock that had been added sometime in the past 3 decades, and which she did not have a key to. She looked at this lock for a moment. Then she looked at Kale. He looked at the lock. Then he put his hand against the door, and there was a soft sound of mechanisms releasing, the kind of sound that old enchantments made when a primordial brought authority to bear on them. The door opened. The restricted section was a single room, smaller than Sarah had expected, lined floor to ceiling with shelves that held perhaps 300 documents in careful protective storage. Sarah stood in the doorway and looked at it, and felt the specific feeling she always felt in the presence of a collection that had been deliberately organized. Someone had put thought into this. These were not documents that had been randomly restricted. They had been gathered, selected, arranged in an order that was not the record hall's standard system. She stepped in and began to read labels. Kyle stood in the doorway and watched her work, which was not a thing he would have predicted himself doing, and which he found, without entirely understanding why, difficult to stop. She found the full Calum Foundation Charter in 15 minutes. Because of course she did. She had spent 7 years building an index of the entire collection, and she knew where things were even when they had been moved. She pulled it from its protective sleeve and carried it to the small reading table and opened it, and then she read, and Kyle watched her read, and the only sound in the room was the occasional rustle of paper and Sarah's breathing, which was slow and steady, and then, between one breath and the next, it stopped. She read the passage again. Then she turned back several pages and read a different passage. Then she turned forward and found a third passage and read all 3 in sequence, and by the time she looked up, her expression was the one she had when she found the land grant, but larger, the way a flame looks when it finally hits something dry enough to catch. "Kale," she said. "Tell me," he said. "The Calem founding family had 2 branches," she said. "The primary branch held the throne for the first 100 years of the kingdom. They were displaced during the consolidation, which is documented in the public record as a voluntary transfer of power. The Foundation Charter says it was not voluntary. It was a forced abdication under duress, and the Charter establishes that any forced abdication is legally void and that succession rights remain with the Calem line regardless of subsequent agreements." She looked at him. "The primary branch died out. They're documented here, generation by generation, until the last recorded heir died without children approximately 200 years ago." She paused. "The secondary branch is also documented, generation by generation. The record continues through the consolidation and beyond." Another pause, longer this time. "The last recorded entry is 40 years ago. A daughter born to the final documented Calem heir. The daughter's name is given as Ashvale, the mother's family name, because the father, the Calem heir, was dead by the time of her birth." She set the document down very carefully. "Ashvale was my mother's name," she said. "She died when I was 2. I have her name because there was no one else to give me one." The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the palace above them, the ordinary business of the court continued. Footsteps and voices and the distant sounds of a working building. And none of it was aware of what was happening in this small stone room, where the archivist was sitting very still with her hands flat on a document that had been hidden for 31 years, because someone had understood, correctly, that it would lead here. Kale crossed the room and crouched down beside the reading table so that he was at eye level with her. It was a deliberate thing, a choice to reduce his own height and presence in a moment when the natural instinct of power would be to increase it. She registered it. He knew she registered it, because she registered everything. "Sarah," he said. "I need a moment," she said. "Take it," he said. He did not move away. He stayed at eye level and let her have her moment while remaining quietly present. It was, he thought, probably the most useful thing he could offer right now. And being useful was something he understood. She took 3 minutes. He knew because he counted. Then she straightened and looked at the document, and then at him, with an expression that had resolved into something clear and determined. "This needs to be verified," she said. "The genealogical record in the charter needs to be cross-referenced against birth records, if any survive, and against the physical evidence, if any exists. A claim of this nature cannot rest on a single document, even a founding one." "Agreed," he said. "What do you need?" "Access to the full collection without restriction," she said. "Time. My assistance. And someone with legal authority to formally initiate a genealogical verification under kingdom law, which would require the signature of either the High Council or the king himself." "You have the king himself," he said. She looked at him. "You realize what this means," she said. "If this is verified, if the charter is legitimate, and the succession rights hold." "Yes," he said. "It means the current legal foundation of the throne is built on a fraudulent transfer of power." "I know. It means the kingdom has been operating under a succession that was legally voided by its own founding documents." "I know that too. How are you this calm?" she asked. And it was a genuine question, not rhetorical. He considered it. "Because the kingdom is real regardless of the paperwork," he said. "The people in it are real. The work I've done for 400 years is real. Documents don't undo that. What they do is tell me that something was broken at the foundation that I didn't know about, and now I have the chance to fix it, which is always preferable to not knowing." He paused. "Also, I chose you. Whatever this means, I chose correctly, and I would very much like to understand the full scope of what I chose before I decide what to do with the information." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You should know that I don't want the throne." "I know," he said. "I want the record hall," she said. I want the history to be accurate. I want the people who erased the Calum line to be held accountable for what they did. And I want the charter to be part of the public record, because the kingdom deserves to know its own history, even the parts that are uncomfortable. She paused. But I don't want to rule. What if, he said carefully, ruling and archiving were not mutually exclusive? What if the person best positioned to ensure that the kingdom's records were accurate and its history was preserved was also the person with the legal standing to make that preservation a matter of law, rather than a matter of one archivist's dedication? She looked at him for a long time. You're suggesting that the crown and the archive belong together. I'm suggesting, he said, that they always should have, and that someone broke them apart for reasons that the documentation is now making very clear. He looked at the charter. I'm also suggesting that we take this one step at a time, because we have a 31-year conspiracy to document and a high council to manage and approximately 300 nobles who are about to discover that the woman they dismissed as the king's unfortunate choice has a prior legal claim to the kingdom they've been fighting each other for. Sarah looked at him. Then, slowly, she picked up her cross-reference journal and opened it to a fresh page. Then let's start at the beginning, she said. Tell me everything you know about the consolidation period. I'll tell you what the records say. Between the two of us, we should be able to reconstruct the full chain of events. That could take weeks, he said. I know, she said. I have the time if you do. He sat down across from her. I have the time, he said. They worked until the candles burned low, and neither of them noticed when Mira came to the door, looked in at the two of them bent over papers at the small reading table, and quietly withdrew without announcing the dinner that had gone cold 3 hours ago. Subscribe right now if you want to see what happens when all of this comes out into the light, because the confrontation with Draven is coming and it is going to be something you will not want to have missed. The documentation process took 11 days. Sarah had worked alone for 7 years and had learned, accordingly, to be efficient with time and resources. But 11 days was still 11 days. And what they built across those 11 days was something that she would later describe to her assistants as the most complete chain of documentary evidence she had ever assembled. It was also, she did not say to her assistants, but thought privately, the closest she had come to collaboration in 7 years of working largely alone. And she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not find it diminishing. Cale was not the kind of person who made space feel smaller. He was the kind of person who had been sitting at the center of things for so long that he had learned to take up exactly the room he needed and no more, which was, in Sarah's experience, a quality far rarer than power. He knew things she did not know. He had lived through events that she could only read records of, and his memory, 400 years of it, was its own archive, imperfect in places but rich in texture and context in ways that no document could replicate. When she found a reference to a consolidation-era negotiation that the records described in procedural language, he could tell her what the room had smelled like and who had been afraid, and what the person who drafted the official record had left out, because he had been there, a young king watching older men make decisions that he had not yet had the standing to oppose. She wrote it all down. She cross-referenced it against the physical documentation. She built the chain link by link. What emerged, over 11 days, was a picture that was both simpler and more damning than either of them had expected. The erasure of the Calum line had not been a sweeping conspiracy of many actors. It had been the work of one family, sustained across 3 generations. The Cass family, of which Lord Draven was the current and most capable representative. The original Cass ancestor who had engineered the forced abdication had done so, with 2 allies who had subsequently been rewarded with land grants, the same land grants whose seals Sarah had first noticed in the misfiled pre-consolidation records. Their descendants were still in court. They were, in fact, among the most prominent houses in the current nobility. The motive was not complicated. The Calum line, as the founding family, held rights under the foundation charter that superseded the noble house system established after the consolidation. Rights of access, rights of oversight, rights of legal review, that, had they been exercised, would have made the consolidation of noble power that had characterized the past 200 years significantly more difficult. The charter had been hidden because it contained the mechanism for its own restoration, and the Cass family had understood this, generation after generation, and had maintained the suppression because the alternative was accountability. On the evening of the 11th day, Sarah closed her cross-reference journal on the completed documentation and looked at Cale across the table. He looked back at her. The candles were lower than usual because they had worked later than usual, and the light they cast was warm and specific, and in it, she looked, he thought, like someone who had just finished something important and had not yet decided what to feel about it. "It's complete," she said. "Yes," he said. "What happens now is a legal process," she said. "The documentation needs to be formally submitted, a review conducted, findings verified by independent legal authority. The High Council cannot conduct the review given Draven's involvement. You would need to appoint an independent panel." "Already planned," he said. "I have 3 retired judges who have been waiting for an assignment for 2 years. I'll send for them tomorrow." She nodded. "And Draven. Draven will be presented with the documentation and given the opportunity to respond," Kyle said. "Formally, through legal process. He will not be arrested without process. He will not be confronted in a dramatic scene that gives him grounds for appeal." He paused. "This is going to be done correctly." "It has to be," she said. "If it's not done correctly, it proves nothing, except that we are capable of the same shortcuts they were." He looked at her steadily. "We are in complete agreement on that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The genealogical verification came back. You saw the results." "I saw them," he said. The independent genealogist they had engaged had reviewed the Foundation Charter's lineage records against 3 independent historical sources and had confirmed the chain of descent with what she had described, in her formal report, as a high degree of documentary certainty. Sarah Ashvale was, by the legal terms of the Foundation Charter, the last living descendant of the Calum founding line. "I am still the archivist," Sarah said. "You are still the archivist," Cale agreed. "And whatever the legal process determines about the succession rights, I am not interested in claiming a throne," she said. "I want the record corrected. I want the Calum name restored to the public historical record. I want the Foundation Charter published and accessible to every citizen. And I want the families who have benefited from the suppression to be required to account for those benefits in a formal legal proceeding." She paused. "That is what I want." "Then that," he said, "is what we will work toward." He hesitated. He was not usually a person who hesitated, and he was aware of it. "There is also the matter," he said, "of the fact that I chose you before I knew any of this, and I would choose you again knowing all of it, and I would like that to be clear." Sarah looked at him. The candle between them made the light warm and specific, and she had, she realized, stopped noting it as an objective feature of the environment some days ago, and started simply experiencing it, which was a shift she filed without quite knowing what category it belonged to. "Why?" she asked. The same word she had used in the Great Hall. This time, it meant something different. "Because," he said, "you walked into the most hostile room in the kingdom, carrying a satchel full of work you refused to abandon, and when I told you I was choosing you, you asked me why, and then you set conditions. You did not perform gratitude. You did not ask what was in it for you. You asked what it meant, and then you made sure the meaning was documented." He paused. "I have been trying to govern a kingdom for 400 years, and I have never once had anyone do the equivalent of what you did in that receiving line. Draven has been afraid of you for 11 days, and he doesn't know your name. The court has been watching you for 2 weeks, and they still don't understand what they're looking at." He looked at her with an expression that was, for the first time, entirely unguarded. "I understand what I'm looking at, and I would like to keep looking if that is acceptable." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is acceptable." And then, because she was who she was and she did not do things by halves, she added, "I find that I have become interested in you too. I think you should know that, So the information is on the record. He smiled. The real one. The small one. The same one she had produced in the Great Hall by asking why. Noted, he said. Shall we continue working? We shall, she said, and opened her journal to a fresh page. Don't go anywhere. What happens in the next stage of this story, when Draven realizes he's run out of room, is something you are going to want to see. The formal submission of the documentation to the independent review panel was conducted on a gray morning with appropriate legal gravity and absolutely no public drama, because Sarah had drafted the submission protocol and she was constitutionally opposed to theater when documentation would suffice. The 3 retired judges received the complete record, the genealogical verification, the procedural analysis of the charter restriction, and the chain of documentary evidence linking the Cass family to the original forced abdication, and signed the receipt of submission, with the expressions of people who understood they were holding something significant, and were grateful for the clarity of its organization. Lord Draven received his formal notification of the review that afternoon, delivered by a royal messenger with 2 witnesses present, as the protocol required. He read it in his private office, alone, and the expression on his face was not observed by anyone. What was observed was that he called an emergency meeting of the remaining High Council members that evening, which Kale's intelligence network reported back in detail, and that the meeting lasted 3 hours, and that by the end of it, 2 of the 6 remaining council members had left by different doors than they had arrived by, which was noted as significant by people who understood court behavior. Lord Farron, whose grandfather had received one of the original land grants, came to Sarah the following morning. She was in the record hall. He was a man in his 60s, who had the look of someone who had recently been persuaded that a decision he did not want to make was necessary, and he stood in the doorway of the record hall with the slightly dazed expression of someone who had entered a room they did not understand, and found it less frightening than expected. "I should like to speak with you," he said. "Come in," Sarah said, without looking up from what she was cross-referencing. "Sit down if you can find a clear chair. I'll be with you in a moment." He found a clear chair. He sat down. He waited while she finished what she was doing, which took approximately 4 minutes, during which he looked around the record hall with an expression that cycled from bewilderment to something approaching wonder. He had never been in the record hall before. Most people had not. "Lady Ashvale," he said, when she set her pen down. "Sarah," she said. "What can I do for you, Lord Farron?" He was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather accepted a land grant," he said, "in the 3rd year of the consolidation. I was told it was a reward for loyalty. I have the documentation of the grant in the family archives." He paused. "I did not know, until I read the submission summary this morning, what the grant was a reward for." Sarah looked at him steadily. "What would you like to do about that?" she asked, in the same tone she used for everything. Not leading, not accusing, simply asking. He straightened slightly. "I would like to submit the grant documentation to the review panel voluntarily," he said, "before it is requested, and I would like it noted that the submission is voluntary, and that my family cooperates fully with the review process." He paused. "I cannot change what my grandfather did. I can determine what I do in response to it." Sarah nodded. "That is the right decision," she said, without softening or amplifying it. "I'll provide you with the submission protocol." He left 20 minutes later with the protocol documents and the expression of someone who has set down something heavy. Sarah watched him go. Then she turned back to her work and made a note in her cross-reference journal and kept going. 2 other families followed Farron's lead within the week. The remaining allied family did not, and their documentation was subsequently requested formally by the review panel, which meant the finding on their connection would be part of the official record without the mitigating notation of voluntary cooperation. Sarah noted this without comment, because the documentation itself was the statement. Draven's formal response to the review panel arrived on the 14th day. It was long, carefully argued, and relied primarily on the doctrine of established governance, the principle that institutional continuity takes precedence over historical legal claims. It was, Sarah read with professional respect, a well-constructed argument. It was also, she assessed with professional clarity, insufficient to the evidence, because the Foundation Charter's language on the invalidity of forced abdication was specific and unambiguous, and established governance doctrine had never successfully overridden a founding charter in kingdom legal history. She submitted a formal response to the panel that was considerably shorter than Draven's. She cited 3 precedents, quoted 2 relevant sections of the Foundation Charter, and concluded by noting that the doctrine of established governance applied to disputes of ambiguous origin and did not apply when the origin of the dispute was itself the product of legally void action. The panel chair later described it to his colleague as the clearest legal brief he had read in 40 years of judicial practice. The panel's preliminary findings were delivered to the king on the 21st day. Draven was found to have facilitated the maintenance of an unlawful charter restriction without procedural authority. The Cass family's historical involvement in the original forced abdication was confirmed as a matter of documentary record. The genealogical verification of Sarah's descent from the Calum line was formally recognized. The Foundation Charter was formally restored to unqualified open access, and I declared a matter of public record. What the panel declined to rule on, because it exceeded their mandate, was the question of succession rights. That question, they noted in their findings, required a formal petition to the kingdom's high court, which had not been convened for a matter of succession in over a century. Kyle read the findings in his private study, alone, at midnight, which was when he did most of his serious reading. Then he sat with them for a while. Then he picked up a pen and began to write. By morning, he had drafted 3 documents. The first was a formal public declaration restoring the Calum name to the kingdom's official historical record, acknowledging the forced abdication as a historical injustice, and establishing a public memorial in the palace to the Calum founding line. The second was a formal petition to the High Court of the Kingdom to adjudicate the question of succession rights as established in the Foundation Charter, with the independent panel's findings as the primary evidentiary basis. The third document was a personal one, addressed to Sarah, which he did not describe to anyone else. He gave the first 2 to his chief scribe for official processing. The third he delivered himself. She was in the record hall. It was early, before 7th bell, and she was already working. She looked up when he came in, assessed his expression in the way she assessed everything, and set down her pen. He handed her the letter. She read it. It was not long. It said, in the precise and unadorned prose he had always found most honest, that he had chosen her before he knew who she was, that he had come to know her over the past weeks and found his choice more correct with each day, that he understood she did not want the throne, and he respected that, and that what he was asking her, as separate from anything legal or political or historical, was whether she would choose him in return, not as a king, but as a person who had found, at 400 years old, something he had not expected to find, which was someone who saw things clearly and acted on what she saw and made him want to be in the room when she was working. She read it twice. Then she looked at him. Yes, she said. That's all? He said. The information is on the record, she said. Both directions. I noted it already. She paused. Also, you should know that I read your original declaration to the court. The one about choosing the least suitable mate. I found a copy in the, steward's files. It was a fairly blunt piece of political theater. It was, he agreed. It worked, she said. It did, he agreed. Not in the way you intended, she said. No, he said. Better. She picked up her pen. Sit down, she said. I need to finish this cross-reference before the panel's formal closure meeting, and I want to show you what I found this morning. There's another gap in the pre-consolidation record that I think connects to a different case entirely. He sat down. She showed him. They worked. If you are enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe and share it, because what is coming next is the resolution that this whole story has been building toward, and you deserve to be there for it. The High Court convened 6 weeks later. It was, by every measure, the most significant legal proceeding in the kingdom in living memory, which meant that the Great Hall was full to its capacity with people who wanted to witness it, and considerably more who wanted to say they had. Kyle had insisted on a public proceeding, because Sarah was right that the kingdom deserved to know its own history, and a proceeding that happened behind closed doors would always be suspected of having been arranged rather than decided. Sarah sat at the petitioner's table with 2 legal advocates she had selected, one a specialist in historical kingdom law, and one a specialist in succession precedent. She had read every document both of them had ever published in their professional careers before selecting them, which they had been informed of during their initial meetings, and which had produced in both cases a slightly stunned expression followed by genuine engagement. Across the table, Draven's legal team occupied 4 chairs and represented everything that the old power structure could assemble, which was considerable. The proceedings lasted 3 days. The evidence was presented. The Foundation Charter was read into the record in its entirety, which took 2 hours because it was a thorough document. The genealogical verification was presented, challenged, and upheld. The panel's findings were formally incorporated. Draven himself was called to testify, and he did so with the dignity of someone who understood that the argument was over, but who intended to lose correctly. Which was, Sarah thought, perhaps the most genuinely honorable thing she had ever seen him do. On the 3rd day, the High Court delivered its findings. The forced abdication of the Calum line was confirmed as legally void under the Foundation Charter's own terms. The Charter's succession provisions were confirmed as valid and legally operative. Sarah Ashvale, as the last documented descendant of the Calum line, held by the terms of the Charter a prior succession right to the throne. The court also found, and this was the part that the assembled audience had not anticipated, that the Charter's succession provisions included a specific mechanism for the exercise or waiver of that right, that the Calum heir could, by formal declaration, choose to exercise their succession claim, waive it in favor of the existing governance structure, or transfer it by compact to another, and that whatever choice the heir made would be recognized as legally binding under the Charter's own authority. The room was very quiet when the Chief Justice finished reading. Then 300 people turned to look at Sarah. She had prepared a statement. She stood up and she read it. Clearly and without performance, in the same voice she used for everything, and it said the following: that she recognized the right confirmed by the court and understood its legal significance, that she had considered it carefully and in consultation with those whose counsel she trusted, that she chose to waive her personal succession claim in the interest of governance continuity, that in exercising this waiver, she made the following formal requests of the existing crown and governance. Structure. First, that the Foundation Charter be enshrined as a permanent constitutional document, and that its provisions, including the rights it established for all citizens, be formally incorporated into kingdom law. Second, that the Archive Oversight Council be reconstituted as a permanent body with genuine authority and adequate resources to fulfill its mandate of preserving and maintaining the kingdom's historical record. Third, that the families who had benefited from the Calum erasure be required to submit to a formal reparative process administered through the legal system, and that the Cass family's leadership of the High Council be dissolved pending independent review of the council's composition. And fourth, that the Calum name, history, and lineage be permanently and publicly restored to the kingdom's official record, including a memorial and a formal day of historical recognition. She set down her statement. She looked at the king. Cale stood up. He was not at the petitioner's table. He was in the witness section, which was where he had sat for the entire proceeding, because this was her proceeding, and he was a witness to it, not its author. He stood up and he said, "I accept all 4 requests. I will formalize the first 3 through legislative process within the current session of the High Council. The 4th I will execute by royal decree effective immediately." He paused. "The record hall will be renamed the Calum Archive. Its head archivist will hold the permanent title of Archive Keeper, a position formally recognized in the constitutional structure alongside the High Council. The Archive Keeper's budget will be set at a level commensurate with the importance of the institution, which is to say, significant." The hall erupted. This time it was not the aristocratic version. It was the genuine version, the kind that happens when people have been watching something real, and cannot contain the fact of having witnessed it. Sarah stood at the petitioner's table and looked at the room and felt something she did not have a clean category for. Something that was adjacent to the feeling of completing a very long and difficult document that turned out to be more important than she had known when she started it. Lord Draven, on his way out of the hall, stopped beside her for a moment. He was a man who had lost something significant today, and who knew it, and his face showed it in the way that honest faces do when there is nothing left to perform. "You are," he said quietly, "a remarkably thorough woman." "Thank you," she said. "You said that before. It bears repeating," he said, and walked out. Mira found her afterward, outside the hall in the corridor, and stood beside her for a moment in the way that people do when they have watched something and need a moment to let it settle. "How do you feel?" she asked. Sarah considered this with the same focus she gave to everything. "Like I finished something," she said, "and like something else is starting." "Something good?" Mira asked. Sarah looked at the doorway of the hall, through which Cale had just emerged and was moving in their direction with the focused walk of a man who has somewhere to be and knows exactly where it is. "I think so," she said. "I'll need more data." Mira made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. "I think you're going to be fine," she said. "Please subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment telling me the moment you knew these two were right for each other, because I want to know what you saw and when." Epilogue. 3 years later, the Calum archive occupied the same underground rooms it always had, but it had expanded. 2 additional vault rooms had been opened in the East Wing's lower level, professionally sealed and climate-controlled with the environmental management systems that Sarah had specified in the budget proposal she had submitted to the new Archive Oversight Council at their first formal meeting, and which had been approved in full, which had produced in her a feeling she was still not entirely sure how to categorize. The collection had grown. The voluntary submissions from the cooperating noble families had added over 400 documents to the pre-consolidation record, filling gaps that Sarah had been noting in her cross-reference journal for 7 years. The gaps were not entirely closed. She did not expect they ever would be entirely closed, but the shape of the history was clear now, and the shape was accurate, and it was public. And those 3 things together were more than she had once thought she would be able to say. She was at her desk at 7th bell, as usual, working through a new acquisition, a collection of personal correspondence from a consolidation-era official that had surfaced in a provincial estate sale, and which contained, she had already determined in the first hour, at least 2 significant references to the early Calum suppression that added texture to the documented record. Her glasses were straight. Her hair was pulled back. She had 2 cups of tea on the desk, one for her and one for the other person in the room. Kyle was at the secondary desk that had been installed 3 years ago, ostensibly for visiting researchers but effectively for him, because he had developed the habit of spending his early mornings in the archive before the day's official demands began. He was reading a report from the newly constituted independent review board that was overseeing the reparative process, which was in its 2nd year and moving at the pace of legal processes, which was to say, slowly and correctly. The Cass family had complied with the process, under the terms of the agreement that had been reached, and the outcome, when it came, would be documented and public and part of the permanent record. Draven himself had retired from public life, following the dissolution of his council position. He sent Sarah a letter occasionally, formal and brief, which she answered in kind, because he was old and he had lost something, and he had, in the end, chosen to lose it correctly. And she was constitutionally unable to be unkind to people who made that choice. "There's a reference here to a courier network," she said, without looking up from the correspondence. "Pre-consolidation. It functioned as an independent information system outside the official court structure. If the records survived, they'd be in the provincial archives." "Which province?" he asked, also without looking up from his report. "Voss territory," she said. "Your ancestral seat." He looked up at that. "I didn't know you could say my name with that tone." "What tone?" she said, and the perfect neutrality of it was itself the tone. the tiny thread of warmth that had taken up residence in her voice when she spoke to him, and which she was, he had understood very early, fully aware of, and entirely unbothered by. The one that suggests I've been hiding documents in my own estate, he said. You haven't been hiding them, she said. You just didn't know to look. She set down her pen and looked at him over her glasses. I'm going to need to go to Voss territory. I will arrange transport, he said. I may be there for several weeks, she said. The provincial archives are not organized. I will come with you, he said. I have not been back to the ancestral seat in 40 years. It is past time. She considered this. You understand that I will spend most of the time in the archive. I understand, he said, that I will spend most of the time reading next to you, which is what I do most mornings anyway, and which I find, consistently, to be a better use of my time than most of the alternatives. She was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was deciding whether to say something that was not strictly necessary, but that she wanted to say anyway. I like that you're here in the mornings, she said. I should have said that before. It's on the record now. He looked at her across the desks, in the warm, low light of the archive, surrounded by 4 centuries of accumulated history that was, slowly and correctly, becoming accurate. I know, he said. I knew when you started leaving the second cup of tea. She looked at the cup. She looked at him. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the correspondence. And the small smile that had appeared did not entirely leave, and the archive was quiet and warm and full of the specific kind of work that matters. And outside, the kingdom continued, reformed and documented and slowly, carefully, becoming more honest about what it was and where it had come from. The Calum name was in the public record now. The history was accurate. The work continued. And the archivist, who had always known that the documents were more important than anyone gave them credit for, had, in the end, been right about that too, as she was right about most things, and she knew it, and she kept working. Anyway, because being right was not the point. The work was the point. The truth was the point. And she had, finally, someone who understood that sitting across from her every morning with a cup of tea and a report and absolutely no intention of going anywhere, that was enough. That was, she had discovered, more than enough. That was everything. Thank you so much for watching this story, all the way to the end. If this one moved you, if it made you feel something real, please leave a comment below and tell me what part stayed with you. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this with someone who loves a story where the quiet ones turn out to be the most powerful people in the room. And I will see you in the next one.